You have a microphone? Thank you. All right. I just love seeing everybody talk and have a great time. That's wonderful. But, it's actually past 9:40 and we have to start. All right. There are a number of ways that some of you may know our presenter today. He's a graduate of Michigan State University. Yeah, I knew some people would cheer. And he's also a graduate of Western Theological Seminary, and
That's right, Jim.
and then became a Reformed Church in America minister. And he spent
Let's hear it for the RCA.
He then spent about 30 years with Young Life here in West Michigan and in Europe. He's been about 10 years executive vice president at Western Seminary as well. He's also the editor of Reformed Journal, which I know many of us read at reformedjournal.com.
Here for the Reformed Journal.
And he also wrote the book Reading Buechner, which I know several of you have also read. I first knew Jeff as the spouse of Gretchen, who is here today, because Gretchen and I work together. Gretchen is a wonderful Reformed or children in worship storyteller, and she was a children in worship trainer when I also worked together on the team with children in worship for the RCA. So Jeff even has hauled books and boxes to APSI. So,
True.
yep, to APSI for me. So that's how I first started to know Jeff. He is here to talk about his new book, Telling Stories in the Dark, Finding Healing and Hope in Sharing Our Sadness, Grief, Trauma, and Pain. So we welcome Jeff this week and next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning, everyone. Wow. This is a somewhat intimidating group. I just want you to know that. They're not only like people that were my professors, there are people that I was in school with that know how limited I am in my intellectual abilities. So that's kind of scary. Dawn, don't say anything. That's all I'm saying. Great to be with you this morning. Great to be at Hope Church and talk about this book, which I just happened to bring a box of with me. They are also available at Reader's World and Barnes & Noble in Holland and Amazon.com. But if you're like me and don't believe Jeff Bezos needs any money, more money, you can get it from me for a better deal. So I'm just saying that. And we're just going to start and jump right in with this. This is the cover of the book and a handsome photo of me. And when I say things like that, you're supposed to laugh, okay? So go ahead and do that. That's like, is he serious? No. So I start this book with a quote from Richard Rohr, who looks a little bit like Jim Brownson in that picture. But the quote from Richard Rohr, you all know Richard Rohr. I go some places and they're like, who? But this is the place. You would know Richard Rohr. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. And that's what we use in the book, but that's not actually the full quote. Let me read the full quote. If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it, usually to those closest to us. Our family, our neighbors, our co-workers, and invariably the most vulnerable, children. You all know the truth that hurt people hurt people. You've heard that before, and we see it all the time. Just open up your news feed and look at the words in the headlines. There's so many violent and angry words being used. And just think about the world right now. Think about a place like Gaza. How much of the pain in Gaza is because somebody was hurt? It's just this never-ending cycle of pain. So much pain in the world. And so I started this book asking myself the question, why? And as a person of faith, I wanted to know where God is in the midst of that. So that raises the theological issue that's called this word theodicy. And this is one of the few places that I've been. I don't want to say anything about any other churches, but, I was at Christ Memorial last week, okay? I'll just throw it out there. This goes online, doesn't it? Yeah. It was fantastic. What a great group they were. Some places I use this word and I get a glazed look. But theodicy is this argument that attempts to resolve the problem of evil that arises when omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omniscience are all simultaneously ascribed to God. If God is all powerful and all loving and all knowing, why do these terrible things happen in the world? That's a conundrum that has puzzled theologians and philosophers for centuries. Marilyn Robinson has a new book out called Reading Genesis, and she makes the claim in there that the whole Bible is a theodicy. The whole Bible is attempting to resolve the question of evil or address the question of the existence of evil. I don't know if I would have said it that way. I probably would have said parts of the Bible. I would have said the book of Job is a theodicy particularly. But she makes the claim that it's the whole Bible that does that. So you guys probably also, this is one of the crowds that you probably also know Tom Lynch. A few of you know Tom Lynch. Raise your hand if you know Tom Lynch. That's great. Tom Lynch is retired now, but he was a funeral director who lived in Milford, Michigan. Now he lives up north, up on Burt Lake, I think. And he is also a writer and a poet. And he wrote a book a few, maybe 20, 30 years ago called The Undertaking, Reflections on the Dismal Trade. And that book became the inspiration for an HBO show called 6 Feet Under. Yeah, that was a very popular show. So this is a poem of his called Theodicy, a Lament, and I just want us to look together at this poem. So it says, for Dan Honan and all who helped. And so a real clue to understanding this poem is to know who Dan Honan is. Dan Honan is a funeral director in Newtown, Connecticut, where the Sandy Hook Elementary School is, where they had a mass shooting. So he wrote this on the heels of that. I thought I'd seen most everything before. The bodies of babies on the table, crib deaths, bad flu, some crueler happenstance, an accident of nature or neglect, toddlers at their tantrums, teens in car wrecks. We'd lay them out in downsized caskets made to fit the outsized sadness, then sort flowers. I'd sometimes wonder, after calling hours, exactly what you had in mind here, Lord. Was well enough not better be left alone? I English the silence much the same as Job. Where were you, child, when I made the world? But slaughtered school kids, teachers, first graders, are we not blinded by the things we've seen? Rent and dismembered, riddled innocence? What shall we say to these things, Lord? Some days we are your chosen, others we're alone. I'm angling for Leviathan, of course, hoping to hook him at his riddling. How's God all loving and all powerful when all week long we've buried children? Do all things work together for the good? Dead boys and girls, ashes and dust, behold, we gird our loins, the whirlwind beckons us. And yet, the blighted mothers walk upright, The hollowed, vacant eyes are yet afire, and ruined fathers, harrowed, tenuous, their slack arms empty, open nonetheless. And friends and neighbors, distant family, brave the journey and god-awful quiet to bide with them and tend the home fires. While colleagues from their far-flung towns appear to brace us in our desperate undertakings, these precious broken bodies, promises. Dear God, what good is anything in all of this? Still, love that seems so distant seems so near. So let's unpack that for a second. He starts this with saying, I'm an undertaker. I thought I'd seen it all, because you do see some grisly things if you're a funeral director. Crib deaths, bad flu, accidents, toddlers, teens in car wrecks, downsized caskets for outsized sadness, very nice little poetic thing he does there. And I'd wonder what you had in mind here, Lord. But I would kind of, I don't quite understand fully. Maybe Dawn, you can help me. English to the silence. I'm not sure. Stop calling on you to help me. Okay, I won't call on you anymore. John, maybe you can help me. No, I'm not quite sure what English the silence means, but it's like I put up with it the same way that Job did, or I reconcile myself to it with Job's resolution was, we don't understand. Where were you when I made the world? But then he goes to this. The shooting, slaughtered school kids, teachers, first graders. And I'm angling it for Leviathan. I'm trying to hook something way beyond my power. But he says it very plainly. How's God all loving and all powerful when all week long we've buried children? And do all things work together for the good? We gird our loins, the whirlwind beckons us. And then it does make a little bit of a turn. In some ways, this reminds me of the Psalms of Lament. The Psalms of Lament usually just go way, way, way down, but then almost all of them make a little turn back somehow. And he said the mothers walk upright, that this idea that life goes on. The ruined fathers, their arms are open nonetheless, that friends, neighbors come and stand with them, colleagues to brace us in our desperate undertakings. Again, nice poetic image there using undertaking in two different meanings. Saying what good is anything in all of this, but that love that seems so distant seems so near. So there's kind of a resolution, but it's also, it's significant, the title. It's not just theodicy, but it's also lament. That's what he's giving voice to here, is a sense of lament. I want to share with you a little bit from this book by David James Duncan called Son House. I love David James Duncan. He hadn't written a novel in 30 years and published this book last year. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. This is one of the few places that I can go and say, when this book came out, I looked it up online, and it was the #1 bestseller in Hindu spirituality. And you guys won't be thrown off by that. Other places were like, whoa. But David James Duncan begins this book with just the most startling way. I don't think I've ever read a book that began like this. This is the first line. Extremely implausible accidents do not feel innocent. And then he goes on, he describes this accident that happened. A little girl in a Mexican cornfield who was killed by a bolt that shook loose from a DC-8 and traveled 7 miles to the earth and embedded into her skull. And she dropped dead. And he says, no rational explanation, not even a correct one, purges the preposterousness from the event. An inch-long bolt, 7 miles, the perfect timing. the tiny target, chance veered so far out of its way to kill this child that some sort of premeditated attack seemed to have been committed. The question then became, by whom? Who was the unseen attacker? Destiny? Fate? God? One wants to know. And one doesn't want to know, because say it is God. That's the first page. I had goosebumps as I read that, and this is a hard book. It's 800 or 770 pages of small print and big wide pages, and it took me 4 months to read, but I kept going, all because of that first page. It just was so powerful. So this all gets to the question, why? Why do these things happen? So when my book first came out, I was sharing it at the Third Reformed Church in a little men's group there, and I asked the group the question, has anyone ever wondered why something horrible has happened? Has anyone asked that question, why? And one of the guys in our group who's in his 90s and is a retired Hope College professor who usually doesn't say much, and he just kind of sat right up when I asked that question, why? And he said, yes, when I was a boy, I wanted more than anything to have a little brother. And finally, my mom got pregnant, and it was a boy. I had a little brother. After about a year, the baby died. He said, I can remember riding to the church. We were going to the first Christian Reformed church in Zeeland. And I can't remember what street he said, but I could take you right to the place. It's only a couple miles away from here. And I was wailing in the car, crying out, why, God? Why? Why? Well, our group just kind of took that all in. And after a minute, I said, how long ago did this happen? And you could see he was doing some mental math in his head. And he said, 88 years. 88 years. And the pain is still real to him. It's vivid. And he said, I tried to talk about this once, 30 years ago, in this very room, in this very church, and I couldn't even get words out of my mouth. So that is a huge question. And knowing the answer is a challenge. So here's two book titles, two book covers from C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed. The Problem of Pain was written published in 1940, and it was Lewis's theodicy. It was his attempt to state why bad things happen. And it is dense and philosophical. And 20 years or so later, he published the book A Grief Observed after the death of his wife. And when A Grief Observed was published, this is not the original cover. When it was originally published, it was not published under the name C.S. Lewis. It was published under the name N.W. Clerk. It wasn't until after Lewis's death that he was identified as the author. And the reason, I believe, why, is because when his wife died, he found no comfort, no solace in the dense philosophical arguments that he'd made in The Problem of Pain. And I don't think he wanted the world to know that those things didn't add up for him.
Didn't he call God something vivisectionist?
Yes, he does. Yeah. So here's a lovely picture of Bishop Tutu. When Bishop Tutu was touring North America after the fall of apartheid and speaking about his experiences. He would go to college campuses, and inevitably he would be asked difficult questions by people, the why type questions. And his standard answer, which he said dozens and dozens and dozens of times, was always, I cannot solve that puzzle, but let me tell you a story. So I believe very much in the power of stories. Why, to me, is a question that we're not going to get a satisfactory answer to. I think if there were a satisfactory answer, we all would have known it by now, and we'd all be very comfortable with it. So for me, I'm very attracted to stories, very attracted to what Bishop Tutu said, and the power of stories. And so let me tell you a story. There's a handsome couple if I've ever seen one. This is Gretchen and me. Gretchen always corrects me and says this picture was taken in 1985, not 1984. But Gretchen, by the way, she's sitting right there. She looks the same. I, however, have changed slightly. I look like somebody who leans very heavily into not a hair shall fall from his head without the will of his Father in heaven. But every time I see that picture, I think, oh, if I only had those shoes, those those high-top leather Nikes. I could make $1 million with those on eBay right now, I think. Well, some of you know that story, our story. I use it in this book, but I want to tell you a little bit about this. Gretchen and I were engaged to be married. I was a student at Western, and about 6 weeks before our wedding, I was house sitting on 30th Street in Holland with a high school kid who was in my Young Life group, taking care of him for a week while his parents were away watching the house. And Gretchen was going to make us dinner one night, and it was a Thursday night, and she came home from where she was working, or came to that house from where she was working, and within 3 minutes of being there, had a massive stroke. She was 24 years old. She was in perfect health. There was no rational reason why this should happen to her, but she became totally paralyzed on the left side of her body. And when the stroke happened, she went into a seizure on the right side of her body. So the left side of her body was dead. The right side, her right arm, her right leg, her face were just kind of swinging, moving. And we were very close to Holland Hospital, so I just took her to the hospital. And there was a nurse that was coming off duty that saw the way that I drove into the emergency room area and grabbed a wheelchair. And so Gretchen's like slumped over with her arm and her leg swinging. Pulled her, we got her into the hospital, and then this is Sleepy Holland, Michigan in 1985. There was no one at the emergency room desk. But this nurse that had come in with me said, I'll go find the person that's supposed to be here. She did. That person came, took a look at Gretchen and said, I'll never forget this, said, is this normal behavior for her? And I have a friend that's a physician that says, that's a good diagnostic question. I was like, it didn't feel like it at the time. They took her away, and I just sat down then in the emergency room waiting area wondering what in the world was happening. And the chaplain was John Engelhard. Right? Did he go to this church? I think he might have. I don't remember where he went to church, but he was a friend of mine, and he saw me, and so he started going back and forth. He stayed late, was telling me what was going on, and I called a friend, and he called other friends, and before long, a lot of people were in the waiting room with us. And the story I want to tell you is something that happened in the waiting room as I was sitting there, and this is probably an hour, maybe an hour and a half after we had gotten there. When something traumatic happens, your brain there's like a switch that flips, and just the adrenaline and the stress hormones take over, and your rational thinking kind of goes offline. And so I just was in this dash to get her to the hospital. Well, some of that was starting to wear off. And I'm sitting there, and I just started thinking about what was going on. And I was wondering, is she going to live or is she going to die? And if she lives, what kind of person is she going to be? How much is she going to recover? And are we still going to get married? And this is the thought that I'm probably least proud of, but I remember very, very well that I had the conscious thought, am I going to be the kind of person that other people whisper about? Are they going to say, oh yeah, you know who he is? He's the guy whose fiance died, or fiance, they didn't get married because of whatever. I remember having that thought. Well, I just started to cry. And I was sitting between two men, older men, guys that I admired. And one of them put his hand on my shoulder. And I thought he was going to say something soothing and fatherly and wise and comforting. And instead, he said, get a hold of yourself. Stop crying. You got to be strong. She needs you to be strong. Well, there's a sense that he was right. I did need to be strong, and I would take a lot of strength I didn't know that I had. But in every other way, he was wrong. He was telling me not to feel what was happening, not to allow myself to feel what was happening. Well, he gave not so good advice, but I'm the one who took it. I followed his advice. I pulled myself together. I stopped crying. I stopped feeling. And for weeks and months and even years after that event, the primary emotion that I could identify was numbness. Just felt numb, with occasional bouts of anger, but mostly just numbness. And it wasn't until some years after that event I was in, do you remember there used to be a bookstore called Booksellers on Main Street? I was in Booksellers on Main Street, and I saw that there was a new book by Frederick Buechner. And I had come to love Frederick Buechner from being a student at Western, having Jim Cook, who opened the world of Frederick Buechner to all of us. And I saw this new book by Frederick Buechner, and I opened it up, and I saw that there was an essay inside called Adolescence and the Stewardship of Pain. And when I saw that Buechner was writing something about adolescence, I worked for Young Life. I couldn't believe it that Buechner was going to write about adolescence. Stewardship, on the other hand, was one of those church words that I didn't want to have a lot to do with. You know, in my book, Reading Buechner, I said that I'm kind of proud of this line that I came up with because I like it. I said that stewardship sounded to me as exciting as mortgage amortization. Just wasn't interested. Well, I read that essay, and I want to share a little bit about it with you. What he does in the essay is he of course talks about the great pain in his life, which was the suicide of his father when Buechner was 10 years old, and how in many ways his whole life has been kind of an engagement with what happened then. But then he goes to Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, which everybody in here knows, and some of you have preached on multiple occasions. A guy goes on a journey, has 3 servants, gives his servants pieces of his property to manage while he's gone, and 2 of them do one thing with they take and trade with it somehow and double what they've been given. And the 3rd servant takes what he's been given, the 1 talent that he's been given, and he buries it. And do you remember why he said he buried it? Because I was afraid. He said he buried it out of fear. He didn't want anything to happen. Well, what Buechner does, which was so mind-boggling to me and spoke to me so deeply, was he says, what if pain is the thing that we're given? Two servants do one thing with it. They somehow trade with it. They somehow use it in some way. The third buries it out of fear. I read that and I felt like, how does he know so much about me? I was like, he lives in Vermont. How does he know my story? So I'm going to give you a little bit of Buechner from this essay. I think that what the parable means is that the buried pain in particular, and all the other things we tend to bury along with pain, including joy, which tends to get buried too when we start burying things, that the buried life is itself darkness and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and the one who casts us into it is no one other than ourselves. To bury your life is to stop growing. To bury your life is to have it wither in the ground and diminish. It is to be deeply alone. It is to be less alive than you were to start with. That may sound harsh and dark and unfair, but it is the way things are. It is the truth. So that set me on a quest. And I've been on that quest since I've read that, of trying to understand this idea of the stewardship of pain. It's a movement, I think. One of the ways I think of this is it's a movement from asking the question why to a different question, the question of what. What am I going to do? What am I going to do with this horrible thing that has come my way? Another question would be how? How am I going to be a steward of this? What could I ultimately do with this that might be redemptive, that might help others? So here's a quote from Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic, that I think is saying the same kind of thing, but just in a different way. The greatness of Christianity is not that it gives us a remedy for suffering. Instead, Christianity gives us a use for it, because suffering is a part of the meaning of life, not a meaningless thing that destroys life. So I've been on this quest of trying to answer this question of what happens when we move from why to what? What happens in our minds? What happens in our relationship to God, our sense of the divine, when we move from why to what? And I actually want to pause right here. We're going to do a little Q&A time a little bit in a few minutes, but can we just pause right now and ask, I want to ask you to think about that. Anybody have any thoughts about how does changing the question from why to what, reframing the question, what's going on when that happens? Is it too hard of a question? Oh, good, there's someone back there who wants to say something.
Well, it just occurs to me that why is kind of a stop sign and what is kind of a green light.
Say a little more about that.
That's all I got.
Oh. Red light,
No,
green light,
I mean,
stop
I
sign.
think why, if you say why, then there's no answer. You just keep saying why, and you don't get an answer. Whereas if you say, what am I going to do, there's multiple choices.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. Terry.
I can't think of a response. I mean, I can think of lots of responses to why. That, all right, so we get an answer for why something happened, but is that really going to satisfy us?
No.
Is that the end of the story? No. It never would be the end of the story for people who have to keep asking why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which was the point I was trying to make with that C.S. Lewis with the, he felt like he'd figured it out, and then it happened to him, and it was empty, the things that he had figured out. Yeah. I think it also, just think in terms of how we imagine God or think of God, that the why question is, in a sense, it's a hostile question to God, right? It's a question that we've got God on the witness stand and we want to get some answers. And the what question moves us to, you're in this with me. We're in this together. And we could go, Nick Waltersdorf, who I interview in my book, and one of the chapters has a new book out. It's just come out in the last few weeks called Living with Grief. And in that book, he very strongly, there's a third chapter that's called Where is God in Suffering? And he very strongly moves to God is in it with us. That God is with us. Emmanuel is the message. So let me give you, that was great. And we're going to have a little Q&A time in a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about, as I put this book together. And I know I was here this summer, or when was that, Terry? Was that this summer? Sometime. With the Gentlemen of a Certain Age. You guys know this group? You're aware of them? There's one of them at least. Yeah, my favorite group of all time. We opened it up for a conversation with that group, and the first comment was, this book wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I said, you guys know how to give a compliment. Go right to my heart. Well, I told them, you might not realize it, but you're looking at the editor of the Flint Southwestern High School Hoofbeat student newspaper from 1976. So I have a lot of qualifications as a journalist. No, as I had this idea for this book, and it was born, and Terry and I are going to actually have a conversation next week, and we'll probably go into some of this, but it was born out of the pandemic in some ways, and born out of a person's questions to me about the stewardship of pain. And at first I thought I could just read everything I could about grief and trauma and pain. And I started doing that, and I spent about 6 months just reading all these books. And at the end of 6 months, I was totally depressed and just low. And I mean, this is not happy reading. And I realized also, there's no way that I can make myself an expert on these things. That this is the work, people do this for a lifetime. And so I said, and I put the project aside for a number of months, and then it suddenly dawned on me that what I could do is I could approach this as a journalist and not pretend to be the expert. That I could simply ask questions and try to find out. And so what I do in the book, which is right here, by the way, and available for $20 today, which is less expensive than you can get it at Reader's World or Amazon, and immediate gratification, because you could hold this in your arms right now.
And you will sign it.
I will sign it, yeah, and I'll put your name on it. And not only that, Gretchen is equipped with Venmo, and I just happened, I don't know how this happened, but I just happened to bring a little Square credit card reader with me today. So I just want you to know I'm full service. So we got it going on. No, what I did in this book, which has a beautiful cover, by the way, what I did in the book was I said to myself, I can tell stories. That's something I'm good at. And so I identified people who had experienced significant pain and trauma and told their stories. But then in every chapter, what I do is the first half of the chapter is telling the story, and then the second half is I process it with a real expert, a subject matter expert. And so the first story I process is with a psychologist. So there's, actually I have a slide that says this. I don't have to try to make it all up. So yeah, the stories I collected include murder, medical error, cancer, suicide, Alzheimer's, and accidental death. Each story is accompanied by reflection from a subject matter expert, including a psychologist, an author, a therapist, a theologian, a pastor, and an artist. So some of the people are fairly well known, like Nicholas Waltersdorf is fairly well known, and I process his story with Mako Fujimura, who's an artist and deep thinker. Marilyn McIntyre is somewhat known. I process one of the stories with her. Other people are locally famous. Like I talked with Chuck DeGroat, who many of you are probably familiar with, who teaches pastoral care and counseling at Western. I talked with Suzanne McDonald about dementia. I don't know if you all have had Suzanne. Have you had her here?
Yes.
You have? Okay, yeah. Has she done dementia here, or has she done?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I talked with her on the Alzheimer's story. So, yeah, and the editor that I worked on with this is a guy named David Crum, who's from he was the religion editor of the Detroit Free Press for about 30 years. And he said to me, I liked reading this because I felt like it was a mystery. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, because every chapter I would read and I would try to anticipate what are the things that the expert's going to bring out of this story. So he found satisfaction in doing that. So I want to share one last poem with you. One of the people I interview in the book is a poet named Rosemary Watola Traumer, lives in Colorado, and she is a remarkable person. Doesn't identify as a Christian, but is more Christian than a whole lot of people that identify as Christians. And she had a 17-year-old son who took his own life a couple of years ago. And Rosemary, she writes a poem a day. I get a poem a day in my email from her. And a couple of years ago, those stopped without any explanation for about 6 weeks. And then she wrote a post that said that her beautiful son had taken his own life and that she needed to take a little break. But maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, she started writing poetry again. And the conventional wisdom is you're not, go someplace, go sit in a cave for a year and then come out and tell us about it. But she just started writing from the depths of her grief. So they're just remarkable, remarkable things that she wrote one after another, and I include some of those in my book. But this is actually a more recent poem. But she keeps playing with and working on grief, and because like the story I told of the guy who lost his little brother 88 years ago, grief doesn't go away. It may change a little bit. Our experience of it may change over time, but it doesn't go away. And so this poem, I just love this poem. It's called What If Instead of Grief? We call it pollination, a process through which we realize the gold of our hearts spills out. And if we are to survive as a species, it requires we somehow exchange this gold with each other. All our hearts splayed open. All our hearts needing what the other hearts have. It's messy, vulnerable. And this is how we go on. Your grief, my grief, this quiet buzz of conversation, this splitting open, this spilling, this sharing, with each other. Isn't that lovely? We have so many messages in our culture that you got to get over it. You got to put it behind you. Don't talk about it. People don't want to hear about it. Judy was in a class I did at HASP earlier this year, and I remember one woman in our HASP class said, when my husband died, my friends said, number one, don't talk about it because nobody wants to hear about it. And number two, you need to just get over this as soon as you can. That was the message that she was given. And what if we gave each other permission to talk about these things? This is what it means. I think this is another thing of what it means to be a steward of your pain, to be open with it, to share about it. So I'm not sure what other slides I have here. Oh yeah, that's a pretty good one too, but I'll talk about that. We'll talk about kintsugi next week. We'll talk about lament. There we go. That's it. That's it. So we have a little time left to have some conversation, what I like to call questions and evasions. And so, no, anything anybody wants to bring up. I was told you guys are talkative, so let's have it.
I remember being a young nurse and taking care of an 80-year-old woman who said to me, I've been going to church twice every Sunday my whole life. Why is God letting this happen to me? I thought, what was she hearing in church?
Right. Yeah.
Are we being prepared for the pain we all are going to have? Or is it a shock to
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I would actually even take that a step further. One is that there's some kind of implicit message that Christians shouldn't have these things happen to them. But another implicit message is that if you are devastated by the thing that happens to you, that's somehow a weakness in your faith. That you don't have enough faith, that if your faith ought to be focused on God and not on these temporal things that happen. That's another message that we get. Okay, there's lots of hands that went up. Okay. Well, we got one back here. Then Jane Dickey, I'm afraid of, but you know, I'll handle the question. So,
Jane
yes,
Dickey's
sir.
going next.
Yeah.
I grew up in a conservative. Okay. I grew up in a conservative Christian Reform household, like many here had. Many here are Calvinist in their roots. And I learned early on from my parents and my minister that God was in control of everything. God was all-powerful. God knew what was going to happen. Predestination existed. My question to you is, do you think that mindset lends to our turning to God and saying, why did you let this happen? Why did you do it?
Sure.
Rather than realizing that sometimes crap happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that mindset, I agree with you 100%, and I would also say that mindset is rooted in a reading of the Bible which doesn't take the whole Bible into account. The whole Bible is a theodicy. Let's go back to that point that Marilyn Robinson made. There's a lot of stuff that happens to the Bible. I'm working right now through a book by a rabbi called Torah Wrestling, and just going back into, I read 50 pages of that yesterday, and going back into these stories in the book of Genesis. These are not happy, clean stories. These are horrible things that happen. But yeah, people have their theology set before they actually encounter what the Bible actually conveys. So yeah, I think that's really true. Jane.
Thank you. This is really more about Buddhism, and I don't know whether you'll have anything to say. And I know a thumbnail sketch amount about Buddhism. But my understanding is that it has a great deal to do with suffering, and that life is suffering.
Yeah,
Period.
right. That's the first of the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, and oh, good, you know more than I do. Okay, so my understanding of the approach was actually to come to a kind of what I would call numbness of. But I don't think you avoid looking at it. I'm not sure whether you look at it, but you're supposed to not feel happy or not happy either, not happy or sad, but reaching this kind of mediocre. And it's interesting how different people in the world try to come to terms with suffering.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that's a big part of
Yeah.
what theology is all about. Have you interacted with Buddhist folk, and how do they respond to your idea that we need to feel this?
Yeah. So I haven't been invited by a Buddhist group to talk, and I don't know enough to say, oh, I know that they think this. But I do agree with you. I believe that the goal of enlightenment is detachment, to be detached from the things. So you detached from love, because grief is a product of love. You have to love to grieve. This is a good thing that we experience. But yeah, so I don't fully know, but I do think that it's another way that in a different culture, different faith tradition, people have tried to resolve themselves to the reality of suffering that happens, and how do we deal with it. Okay, we've got another one. Where am I going next? Kathy? Okay.
Is that on? Okay, is it on?
It's not on, it's not on, you're gonna have a green light at the bottom.
The top switch, there you go.
Okay, it's on. Okay. The other night, I mean, all my life, almost 70 years now, I've been asking a question. Why did you let that happen? And, I came to the conclusion over the years that you can't ask that question. You don't know why. But the other night in bed, I was thinking about it again. And then I said, now, Kath, what would happen if God answered all the prayers? Mm-hmm. What if nothing, every time you said, why is this happening? God fixed it. Well, I've been thinking about that all week, trying to picture that. And it can't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
certainly,
everybody's asking different things.
Certainly not the way the world works, yeah.
No, it
Yeah.
just can't happen the way we want it, as a child would want it.
Yeah.
Fix it, please fix it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I wanted to say was that sometimes when you ask why, you said hurt people hurt other people. And that's what is the cause of so much of the conflict in the world. Why did you come and, attack us? Well, we're going to have to attack you back. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the why of asking God, where does that come in? It's like, somebody abused my child. Well, I'm going after that child. Mm-hmm. I mean, that person. Yeah. Rather than turning against God.
Yeah.
Where does that come in?
I don't know the answer to that, Kathy, right. But I can tell you a story.
Okay.
Well, no, I don't know. That's the perpetuation of violence, the perpetuation of hatred and pain, because these things happen and people can't step back away from them. So, great line from... why am I not thinking of Viktor Frankl? I couldn't come up with his name. Between stimulus and response, there's a space, right? And so we choose. We don't have to. But I thought what you were saying was, what if God came and answered the question of why, which Jim Cook, of blessed memory, so vividly, you've probably heard him say this. He said when his son died, he knew that if God himself were to appear and write down the answer on a piece of paper and hand it to him, Jim said, I would have wadded the paper up and thrown it into God's face. There's not an answer that's going to satisfy me. Yeah. So, Sybil.
Jeff.
Hi. Sibylla. I'm sorry.
Remember Bob Bedingfield?
I do remember
I'm sure
Bob
you know
Bedingfield.
Bob Bedingfield.
Yes.
And I think he had a line that has stayed with me, and I say it and I pass it along to people at Freedom Village. God gets us out of nothing, but through everything.
I remember that.
And you know, you say that to yourself, and it is comfort. God gets us out of nothing just because we're Christian, but he gets us through everything if we rely on him.
Yeah. Thanks.
Because life is complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, Steve Bauma-Prediger, man, are you going to say something, Steve? These are just one intimidating person after another that's going to say something here.
No, just a quick blurb about Nick Ollerstorff's book, Lament for a Son. My students in Muskegon Correctional Facility, I'm teaching the prison program, we're going to be reading and discussing that book in the next couple Wednesday nights. So I just want to pull a plug in, because that's one of the best
that's a great book.
I've used in teaching for 30 years on this topic in philosophical theology courses. After all the theodicies, Nick says, the hell with them, but God is with me in my suffering. In this case, the tragic death of one of his sons.
Yeah.
So I just want to emphasize how good that book is on this very topic.
Yeah.
So.
And Nick, Lament for a Son.
Lament for a Son.
I actually skipped over it. I cite it very much in and it's How Do We Teach Lament? That's the book. It's a great book. It's written in the late 80s. He just said in this latest book, he's been teaching in the Calvin Prison Initiative and has found a lot of meaning in doing that. And he said he came to think of a prison as a house of grief. And one of the prisoners corrected him and said, Nick, it's not a house of grief. It's a warehouse of grief. But that was a powerful image. So I think we're done for today. And did I happen to mention I brought books with me in case anybody wants one? So next week I'm going to be back, and Terry and I are just going to have a conversation together, and you guys will be involved in the conversation. So Judy wants to say, something.
We got a comment here from David Myers. Jeff, your storytelling left us with Gretchen in the emergency room. Might you want to finish that story and what you both took from it? Maybe next week, or maybe some now.
Yeah, well, we finished the story by saying there's Gretchen. That's, in some ways, that's the story. We have 2 adult children, and we can talk about that some more next week. That's a great question for us to talk about, Terry. So thank you all. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you, Jeff. And if you haven't heard, Jeff brought books.
Just saying.
I already have mine. But if you would like one, you can see Jeff after today, and Jeff will be back with Terry next week, as you hear. So thank you.